Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the second day of the University of Minnesota Extension, the fifth annual Pollinator Webinar Series. That's kind of crazy to say. We've been doing this for 5 years. So today is the second session of a three-part series where Dr. Elaine Evans will be covering the topic, the latest buzz on bee research. So before we jump in, I'd like to give a quick shout out to our amazing extension team for making this program possible. So joining us today is Quincy Sadowski, who is an extension educator in Stearns, Benton, Morrison, and Sherburne counties. Katie Druitz, extension educator in Houston and Fillmore counties. And myself, Tara Young, extension educator in Hubbard County. So Quincy and Katie will be helping us answer questions, which I am very, very grateful because you guys have lots of great questions. So it's nice to kind of tag team things. So just like yesterday, I'd like to go over how we can all engage with each other in a Zoom webinar format if you're not familiar. So if you have any questions for Elaine, you can use the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. I'll only be pulling questions from there. If you'd like to share any comments or like experiences, things that worked well for you, things that didn't, just feel free to use the chat. That's where we'll be putting those things. So we have a really, really engaged audience, and I just love to see all those chats and conversations going on there. But if it ever does get distracting as a participant, you can always click the arrow on the little caret of the chat window to turn off show chat preview. So you can focus right on Dr. Elaine's presentation. So as a reminder, today's presentation is being recorded, and I'll be emailing all those recordings out on Friday, along with any of the resource links that any of the speakers have shared. And because there's often a lot of great resources, I like to bundle them all together in one place. So don't worry if you don't catch them all. So we'll make sure that you have everything. So on to Elaine and today's presentation. So Dr. Elaine Evans is a University of Minnesota extension educator and researcher whose work focuses on pollinator education and bee conservation. She completed both her master's and PhD in entomology here at the University of Minnesota. Elaine is also the author of Befriending Bumblebees, a guide to raising local bumblebees and managing alternative pollinators. Her work helps monitor pollinator populations, improve the impact of pollinator habitat, and translate research into practical, actionable steps for conservation, which we all love to see. So we are very lucky to have you here with us today. Elaine, we are ready for you.
Thank you, Tara. Very happy to be here with you today. And I'm going to be going through some of these, some newer research and interesting research on bees. And so I'll be covering a few different topics. I'll be sharing some research on honeybees, general bee diversity, some information about rare bees, bee habitat, and also I'll be talking about rusty patch bumblebees. And as I'm going through, I will be, you'll sometimes see these things down in the corner where I have the reference for the scientific paper, and one of those resources that I'll be sharing will be a document that has links to those resources if you want to read the actual paper. So yeah, I was just giving an introduction to the topics I'm going to cover and letting you know that as I'm going through research, I'll have these slides where I talk about scientific papers, and I have the references down in the corner. So for this one, Dolan et al. 2025 is a paper that then I will be sharing a list of a document that has links to the actual papers. So if you want to dive into looking at the peer review paper, seeing what else went into to these results, I encourage you to do that if you're curious about that.
So yeah. If people didn't hear clearly, I'm going to be sharing a document that has lists of the scientific papers that I'm going to be referencing. So you should be able to directly access all of those papers if you're interested in reading more about how these things are done. It's always interesting to see how people actually do these studies besides just what they find. I wanted to give a brief background on myself besides just my academic credentials. So I was born and raised, and I still live in St. Paul, Minnesota. I grew up Mostly playing lots of music. A lot of people that get into entomology, which is what I have my degrees in, a lot of people as kids were chasing bugs around, but I was mostly just, playing in orchestras and doing things like that. It really wasn't until I was a young adult when I really started being fascinated with wild places. And my motivation for studying biology was that I just wanted to be able to spend time outdoors. So I wanted to have a career where I could be out in nature. I pretty quickly went to insects as something that was really interesting to me. I was interested in conservation. It was a neglected field, still is. Insects are still very neglected in terms of conservation, and they do so much for us. I ended up dedicating most of my time to bees. Bees were one of the easier insects to try to explain to people how important they are because their impact, the food on our plates, they're impacting all these food webs all around us through their pollination of plants. There are lots of other insects that are doing lots of other important things too, but we are just gonna talk about bees today. Before I launch into things, I'm hoping that you'll bear with me while I do want to share something. I want to get the wording right for this, so I'm actually just going to read a little statement here. I'm usually off the cuff as a speaker, but I want to get this wording right. So I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that the last several weeks have been very challenging in many parts of Minnesota. Many Minnesotans have responded by spending more time taking care of and protecting their neighbors. At this time, I don't want to put extra expectations on people's limited time when so many communities need neighbors working together. That being said, during this talk, I also want to let you all know about our programs for volunteers. We've accomplished amazing things with the help of volunteers, and we will continue to provide training and volunteer opportunities, and we deeply appreciate all that everyone does for bees and for each other. So I really appreciate seeing all the hearts there. Thank you so much. Pollinators are by definition connectors. So I really love this aspect of pollinators where as we're learning about them, learning about their connection, it provides us with a chance to really see this definite example of connecting and providing mutual support to each other. I want to start out by just with having some information about how the pollinators are doing. So there are a lot of different pollinators out there. Most of them we don't know about. Some we know are in decline. So bumblebees are an example of a pollinator where we have good information on their population, and unfortunately, they're not doing very well globally. It's about 1 out of 3 species of bumblebees that are in decline compared to how they used to be doing. The rusty patch bumblebee is a federally protected endangered species we have here in Minnesota. Once common, now facing extinction. We'll talk about them more later in the talk today. Also, one of the bees that we know a lot about how they're doing are honeybees. And a lot of the reason for this is because we are able to go into their hives. Most of the honeybees that we see are managed colonies. They the populations are not in decline because they are this managed population, but you've likely heard about health problems that they're having. So beekeepers are able to split colonies, raise more bees. That does add stress on them. We'll be talking about that a bit more. But just to be realizing that honeybees are not, our concerns for them are more their health problems rather than their populations. So here's a little question. You can use the chat if you'd like to answer this. It's just a true or false that keeping honeybees will help save the bees. And I know that's a very broad statement. But yeah, lots of falses coming in there. So honeybee, I was just talking about their populations not really being at risk. And there's some situations where having too many honeybees, a high density of honeybees in some areas could put some wild bees at risk, as they can deplete floral resources and possibly spread diseases. We're going to talk more details about that too. And these high populations can also be a stress for other honeybees for the same reasons of those kind of resources and diseases that are things to be mindful of with our managed honeybees. At the Bee Lab, we have these 4 actions to help pollinators that we like to talk about. So we talk about planting flowers, providing homes, taking climate action, and collecting data. And I'll be returning to these throughout the talk, so I just wanted to mention them here at the beginning. And I've been talking about the Bee Lab a bit. A lot of the research I'm going to talk about with you today is research that came out of the University of Minnesota Bee Lab on the St. Paul campus. I will be bringing in some other research from other places too, but we have a lot of things that have been going on here at the Bee Lab. And this is a picture of our building here, which we are coming up on our 10th anniversary of this beautiful building that we're able to have as a hub for bee research. So we are just about to start planning something, but keep an eye out for some kind of big public celebration sometime this year as we celebrate 10 years in our bee research facility. To explain what this means, what's going on in the Bee Lab, here is some of the structure. So we have 2 different professors that are both in the entomology department that are based out of the Bee Lab. One focuses on honeybees and one focuses on native bees. Marla Spivak has been the honeybee researcher. She is actually recently retired, and we're in the process of hiring another honeybee professor. We do still have Dr. Dan Caraveau, who focuses on native bees. And so we have those 2 main labs within the building. And then we have some people floating in between. So I'm one of those. I'm an extension educator. Katie, and I focus mostly on the native bees. Katie Lee is an extension educator who focuses on honeybees. And then we also have the Bee Squad, which is a outreach and education and supporting research. They work to support all the different things happening in the Bee Lab. To give you an update on honeybee health, this is a graph that includes more recent information from that looks at colony losses. So I mentioned that honeybees have health problems. The sad part of this is that there are consistently high losses of honeybee colonies. There are these 3 different colors here. The yellow are the summer losses, blue are winter. The main one to look at here is that pink, which is the annual. So that's kind of the overall losses that have been happening. So over a long time, looking here back through 2011, there are, between 30 and 40% of colonies that are lost every year. So if anybody works with other kinds of livestock, that is a lot of loss to have to go through and replace every year. Unfortunately, some people may have heard some things in the news just this last year. If you look at these last 2 years, in 24 and 25, you can see that this number has bumped up to more like 55% of colonies that are lost annually. There are many different things going on with the colonies. The biggest health risk for honeybee colonies continues to be the varroa mite. This is a parasitic mite that also transmits diseases to honeybees. But so this graph here has different types of beekeepers based on the number of hives that they're operating. But a lot of them are dealing with these same stresses that can cause colony loss. Pesticides, pathogens, and queen failure are other big struggles for beekeepers. And I also just wanted to point out here that there's an increasing number of beekeepers that are noting problems with weather. And so as we get farther into our climate change future, there are more extreme weather events. So a lot of different things with the extreme weather events can be stressful for honeybees, and beekeepers are seeing those impacts. So droughts as well as floods, and of course wildfires are all big stressors for beekeepers and for those honeybees. So all of those pieces that are impacting bees, a lot of them center around kind of habitat loss in the middle. And we put habitat loss in the middle because it has such a big impact on everything else. So pollinators are facing these challenges from fewer flowers, more pesticides, parasites, global climate change, and there's all these interactions as well between these challenges. Habitat we put in the center because it can help bees make it through a lot of these other things. If bees are getting better nutrition, if they're getting better food, they have a better chance of being able to stay healthy. I wanted to point out another aspect that's kind of related to some of these. So more kind of looking at our bigger systems of what we have going on in terms of how honeybees are kept and managed in agricultural systems. And this was some work from a PhD student from the Bee Lab. And she was really has a paper where she was really looking at some of the root causes in history in terms of industrial agriculture leading to more monocrops, which leads to less nutrition out there on the landscape for bees, more agrochemicals, which increases that pesticide exposure, wild bee decline, which then makes us more dependent on bringing in pollinators from the outside. And then with those, with that industrial level of beekeeping, there's a lot of bees that are kept close together, are moved across the country, that can increase stress and strain for increasing levels of parasites and pathogens. But at the Bee Lab, we do have research focused on what we can do to help to keep honeybees healthy. So a big project that Marla Spivak has worked on is to breed honeybees that are resistant to varroa mites. So this has been in the works for a while. They've been selecting colonies that have lower levels of mites and viruses over the season. They then see who survives over the winter without treatment. So beekeepers are usually having to treat their colonies with miticides in order to get them to survive the winter because the mites are so big of a stress on them. But seeing who can survive without those treatments and then propagating queens from those stocks. And they've been having good results, especially for the first year, seeing around 80% or higher of those colonies that survive 1 year with no treatment. Going to 2 years, that goes down a bit, but it's still over 50%. There's beekeepers, a few beekeepers that are working with the bees and are giving good reports. Besides Marla, there are a number of people at the Bee Lab who have really helped make this program a reality. I also wanted to talk about some research. In the introduction, I was mentioning some possible impacts of honeybees on other bees through pathogens, and so this is a concern because we know that pathogens from one bee, when that bee lands on a flower, those pathogens can end up on that flower. And another bee that lands on that flower can pick up those pathogens, resulting in this pathogen spillover where pathogens are moving between different groups of bees. And a big concern is from honeybees to other bees, since honeybees can sometimes be kept in dense populations, and we know they can have problems with their health. So we did a study and looking at some of this happening between honeybees and just bumblebees is what we were looking at, and some definitions here. of a more refined view of just, this spillover. So there are these different levels that increase in risk as we kind of go down. So the first one is just exposure. And so that's where the honeybees would, the honeybees have viruses that are replicating in them. They deposit them on the flower. Bumblebees are exposed, and it may be present on their body, but they don't actually get infected. So when some people are just looking for, are these viruses around? They're around, but the bumblebees aren't necessarily getting sick from that. The next level is this dead end spillover, where the viruses either partially replicate or they fully replicate, but not to the extent that they are replicating enough to transmit to other bees, other bumblebees. So this is what's called dead end spillover. So there can be bees that are getting sick from some of these viruses, or the viruses may be replicating and not causing too many problems for them, but it can potentially cause problems. But those bees, bumblebees, need to be continually exposed to honeybees in order for the system to keep going. They're not passing it on to other bumblebees. Spillover with expansion, that's the biggest worry, that's the biggest concern, where these viruses would be maintained in the bumblebee populations regardless of whether or not the honeybees are around. So to do this study, we collected bumblebees in areas that were surrounding apiaries, and we knew what was going on with the viruses at those apiaries. We also raised bumblebee colonies and placed them out near apiaries. And then we had colleagues that were able to sequence the viromes, the viral community that they found in those bees. And what we found was that there were no bumblebee-specific strains of honeybee viruses, so we didn't see those viruses replicating and adapting to bumblebees. That's what this picture down in the corner here is representing. The red points are representing the genetic structure for those viruses for the honeybee viruses. The blue dots are the same thing, but for bumblebees. And you can see there's a lot of overlap. So there's 98% similarity between those. We did find a fair number of viruses that are normally associated with honeybees within the bumblebees. So sac brood virus, deformed wing virus, black queen cell virus were all there, but what we saw was that this was due to this dead end spillover, where the viruses weren't adapting and being spread to other bumblebees. Another potential risk from honeybees to native bees is from resource competition. So there was a recent study. This one was from researchers that were in Italy. So there was an island that had not had honeybees before, and they introduced them in 2018. They were able to also then manipulate these honeybee colonies. They would close them off and compare when the honeybees were there and not there to see what happened with resource availability and the foraging behavior, as well as the different kinds of plant networks that the bees were visiting. And they did see changes where there was, when the honeybees were excluded, there were more resources available. The bees that they were observing were able to forage more efficiently. And there was a broader more connections between flowers and bees in the networks. They also just looked at the populations of these wild bees, and they did see ongoing decline in the abundance for these species that did have resource overlap with the honeybees. There has been a lot of different research done on this, and the results are often different. So the results from these kind of studies can vary depending on the availability of the resources that are out there in the environment. but there was a good study that was done almost 10 years ago now that was looking at all of the research and summarizing. So with this graph here, we're looking at the number of studies that involved managed bees, impacts on native bees, and so if it's in a plus here, that would be that there was a positive effect of having those managed bees on the wild bees. 0 was no impact, and then the negative and mixed both have aspects of those negative impacts. So you can see there were more studies than not that did show a negative impact of honeybees on the other bees. Again, that does vary, but it is something to be aware of as we're looking at how we're using our environments, what bees we're supporting when they're out there. So I am now going to give a little summary of some kind of action steps to take from this. I'm also going to pause for questions, so particularly honeybee questions. If you want to get those into the Q&A, we can take some time for that over the next few minutes. So the main takeaways that I've gotten from these studies are that it's really important to provide those pesticide-free flowers for honeybees, especially in agricultural areas where we know that they may be under more stress. Honeybee research, especially for honeybee health, supporting honeybee health, can really be beneficial, not just for the honeybees, but for all of the bees. And to be mindful of protecting declining bees if there are situations where they could be being exposed to high densities of honeybees. Providing more diverse flowers can help with that, because often these wild bee populations have kind of broader, the communities will have a broader range of flowers they're visiting. So having many different types of flowers can also help to support those different types of bees.
Perfect. That was a great synopsis of honeybees. So I like this format. Then we'll do questions on honeybees, and really what I've kind of boiled down to a couple of comments is a lot of you are validifying people's experiences as backyard beekeepers and just as hive owners, that they are experiencing these same problems that you have demonstrated. So it's almost solidarity that everyone is having issues. But one of the questions is that is there a way to check on the density of hives in an area to help in deciding if the impact of these hives on the native bees is too much? Is there any resources you know of?
No, that's a great question, and unfortunately, it's really hard. We have these pieces of evidence. Things change so much in different environments in terms of how many flowers are blooming even over the season. It can change a lot in different areas, and there is, in most places, there's not a lot of information available about where honeybee colonies are located. Beekeepers are often keeping these on private property, so that's private information. You can make observations. If you are putting in a pollinator planting, you can do your own observations and look to see if you see a lot of honeybees there, if you see flowers that the honeybees favor, making sure they have enough of those so that they can get what they need, but then also having other flowers that other bees will use. So we don't have super solid numbers, but we have some general recommendations.
Perfect. And kind of going along with that, are there recommended distances that you would tell people and as new beekeepers?
Yeah, so honeybees will forage with, most of them are going to be within a mile to a mile and a half of the colony. So it's and when you have the colony bee colony in the middle and you make that circle around them, it's a lot. So honeybee colonies really have a pretty big footprint in the environment, but having them spaced out so there can be spaces that are a mile away is usually enough that there may still be some honeybee forages coming out there, but there won't be very many.
Sure. And all these studies, all these research studies on the survivability of honeybees, do you know, is that just a localized effort or is it across the United States they're seeing?
Yeah, that's across the United States. So those numbers I was showing were from national surveys with hundreds of beekeepers.
That's devastating. Wow. That's very unfortunate. Can honeybees get food sources from non-native flowers more so than native bees?
It depends on the native bee. So there are some bees, we'll talk about in a little bit, that are really focused on particular flowers. And they often are focused on the native flowers that they're co-evolved with. Some bees, like bumblebees, are more generalist foragers. They'll go around on all kinds of different plants. So with it, yeah, it varies. Some bees are able to use those non-native plants, and some don't.
And Kenya in the chat had brought up a good point that honeybees are short-tongued. Mm-hmm. So then the deeper flowers are native bees. Do they have longer tongues?
Some of the native bees have longer tongues and some of them don't. So some of them have shorter tongues. For looking at just bumblebees, there's some of the bumblebees that have the same tongue length as the honeybees. Some of them do have the longer tongues to get in those deeper tubed flowers. With those deeper tubed flowers too, sometimes even besides tongue length, there'll be teeny tiny bees that just crawl into the tube to get down to the nectar. So there's a few different strategies.
Everyone's a little different. Yeah. Are the flowers that native bees? Oh, no, that moved on me. So what is the foraging season for honeybees? Is that different than native bees?
Honeybees are their colonies are perennial. So we're talking about the overwintering success. So they stay in their colony. They stay active through in their colony through the winter. They're not flying out because it's too cold outside. But as soon as it warms up, they're out flying. So they will be out even before they should be. If it warms up a little bit, they'll fly out to take a bathroom break and then go back in their colony. But they'll be out, as soon as stuff is blooming, they'll start collecting pollen and they'll go through till frost. Whereas most of the native bees have a much shorter season, so they're only out for a couple weeks. And there's a lot of different species that can kind of come out at different times. So bumblebees have a little bit longer. They're in Minnesota, typically like April through September. There's some other native bees that have long seasons like that, but many of them are only out for like the month of April or the month of August.
Sure. I wonder how many more questions should we take about honeybees regarding the rest of your presentation?
Yeah, maybe one more, and then we'll make sure we have time for the other stuff.
Because we have a lot of questions that are the interaction of honeybees and native bees. So I think there's good discussion here. So let's do another one. So are there flowers that natives like that honeybees don't? And that's
yes. So that's part of the recommendation for having these kind of diverse flowers. There are flowers that are difficult for the honeybees to get into, or they just don't have enough resources there for them. So honeybees, they tend to focus on the most productive resources on the landscape. So perhaps people have heard about the dance language that honeybees have, where they are able to communicate to each other where the best resources are. And then each colony will focus on whatever is producing the most nectar or pollen that they need at that time. So a lot of times they're not foraging as broadly. They'll focus. But some of the problems with interactions can happen when everybody is trying to use that same resource, and honeybees they have such big colonies. They have that communication. They're so efficient and effective at getting the resources that there can be times when they get there and get most of what's there, and there are some bees that aren't going to switch to other plants.
Sure. And maybe just one more question,
Okay.
if I can sneak it in. So this one user has both native flower garden and an orchard, and more like a monoculture of plants. So, and it seems that the honeybees are more interested in going to the orchards and the one single kind of flowering plant. Is that consistent with the research that you've seen?
Yeah, so that fits with that. If the orchard is really, if that's the most productive thing right now, and usually when orchards are in bloom, there's just so much there, and so it's a lot easier to get a lot of the one thing at a time. A lot of bees, for each foraging trip, they'll focus on one flower. That kind of just helps their efficiency for figuring out how to get the resources out of the flowers. So if there's one flower where it's kind of all over the place, they can really quickly go from flower to flower and get a lot of those resources.
Perfect. I think a lot of these other questions might be answered in the rest of your presentation.
Okay.
So I'll let you.
We can come back to other questions. So, looking at honeybees, going back to these 4 actions, we talked about planting flowers. We talked about the impact of climate. We didn't mention the action, which is to take climate action, which there's lots of resources to help you figure out what to do there. If you need any help with those, feel free to reach out. And also, the importance of getting more data on how to keep our honeybees healthy. So I mentioned this a little bit with the generalist versus specialist foragers. So here's some beautiful pictures. A lot of my pictures are from Heather Holm. If anyone saw her talk yesterday, I use her beautiful photos because she has such amazing photos. So there are a lot of bumblebees will visit a lot of different types of plants. You can see here there's flat flowers, deep flowers, all kinds of different colors. If you're a plant geek, you can see there's a bunch of different plant genera and plant families that are noted here. But there are some bees that just go to one particular kind of plant, have a very narrow breadth of their diet. So we call these specialist foragers. They can specialize just on a family of plants like sunflowers, or they can specialize on a group within that family, such as goldenrod. And I wanted to give that background before we get into bee diversity, because there's a lot of connections with those habits of bees and bee diversity. So we have a paper that came out in 2023 that was our first real assessment of the number of bee species that we have in Minnesota. And this was headed by Zach Portman, who is a bee taxonomist that works in the Carriveau Native Bee Lab. And that list, when it was published, had 508 species of bees. But in just the few years since then, we've actually creeped up, and we're now at 525 species of bees in Minnesota. We have partners at the DNR that continue to go out and do surveys, a lot of times focusing on looking for those specialist bees. And they've done a really good job of finding those specialists. So a few highlights of the newer bees. One is this bee called Calides ciliatus. It is a dodder specialist. So dodder is a parasitic plant. So continuing on the parasitic theme, another one of these bees that we were very excited to find here in Minnesota is Epiloides pilosus. So this bee actually parasitizes another bee, and that bee is a specialist on Lysomachia plants. We also have recently found Diadasia australis. This is a bee that's more common out west. It's just kind of a adorable, fun bee that we're very excited to find here. I did want to also, in case people didn't see Heather's talk, to let you know about her website, beesmn.org, Native Bees, Minnesota Native Bees. If you want to learn about about the diversity of bees. There's cool ID tips. There's lots of biology information as well as plants. So lots and lots of information on this website that's beautiful to look at and really well organized. Moving on to some more research from the Bee Lab. One of the questions we have when we're trying to put habitat out there for pollinators is, we know flowers make a difference, but can we maximize the impact by how we're planting it? So we had an experiment that we did in Southwest Minnesota where we had 3 different things that we were varying with these different plantings that we did. So we had large plantings and small plantings. We had plantings that had 3 different levels of natural habitat around them. And we also had 2 different seed mixes. So one seed mix that was designed more for honeybees and one seed mix that was designed more for native bees. And so for this, I am just showing the results of one of these in this graph here. This is a little complicated, similar to what I was showing with that virome graph, where we're looking at the overlap between these two. So each of these dots is representing the bee community at a site. And those sites, in green, have the native bee seed mix, and the sites in green have the honeybee seed mix, and the sites in orange have the native bee seed mix. And you can see that there's a lot of overlap. So we might have expected native bees to do better at the site where we planted things that were designed more for native bees, but they did well as well in terms of their diversity and abundance on those sites with the honeybee mix. There were also no differences in those other things we looked at, the surrounding habitat or the planting sizes. I'm going to move into talking some about some nests. So I just want to give a little brief overview of what bee nesting is like. So most of the bees we have in Minnesota nest in the ground. There are some social bees that nest in the ground. A lot of them are solitary, where there's a mother that gathers pollen. She has a little hole she's dug in the ground. She puts the pollen in there, lays an egg on it, and then that's kind of it. About 14% of our bees in Minnesota are cavity nesting, so they'll nest either in stems or in holes in logs that beetles might have bored out from the tree. And then we have bumblebees. Bumblebees are kind of doing their own thing. So bumblebees are most often associated with nesting in spaces with old rodent nests. So they like to have a cavity and they like to have insulating material in there. So those rodent nests, mouse nests, voles, chipmunks, all kinds of different rodents can be either above ground or below ground. Those are where our bumblebees are mostly nesting. And this nesting comes into play as we're kind of looking at these rare bees. So as we're filling in our numbers of bees in Minnesota, we're finding more rare bees and are trying to understand what's going on with them. A lot of rare bees are those specialist foragers where they have particular plants they're associated with, but they can also be picky about where they nest. So I'm going to highlight a couple different research projects from Marissa Chase, who's a postdoctoral researcher in the Carriveau Native Bee Lab. And the first system she was looking at is this system with Dahlia purpurea, the plant purple prairie clover, and the bee Perdita purpallida. And Dahlia tends to grow in sandy soils, and the perdita bees tend to nest in sandy soils. So there's this question of, what's more important, the flowers or the sand? How important is the sand content to that bee community that's there foraging on the dahlia flowers? And so Marissa had found that sand content was not impacting the diversity of bees, but it had an impact on the abundance of bees. So besides just that Perdita purpallida bee, there are other bees that like dahlia and may like nesting in soil. And you may think, oh, if they like sand, we'll give them lots of sand. But we're finding that they actually prefer this kind of medium level of sand. And looking at the bees that are there in terms of if they are considered to be sand specialists or not. So even those bees that seem to really like nesting in sand, they still are more of them that are found when you have that kind of medium level of sand. The other rare bee system that Marissa's been studying is Calidae andrewsi and Heuchera richardsonii. So Heuchera is a prairie alum root plant. And with this, Marissa's been picking apart how floral host density affects the population size and the nest density for this bee that relies on those flowers. So Calides is called a plaster bee or a cellophane bee. They have a film that they secrete when they're making their nest that is very much like polyester. It's a very kind of crinkly, waterproof film that they line their nest cells with. The two here, the drawing is based on this actual nest excavation next to it. So Marissa, in studying these, would excavate the nest, trying to leave the structure there. So the arrow here is pointing to the bee's tunnel that goes down in, and then you can see the holes here. You can see some of that white stuff there in some of the holes. That's that cellophane, and we have this beautiful drawing representing what this nest would look like. So each mother bee is going in and just provisioning 4 or 5 of these of her babies in those nests. For this study, Marissa was looking at these communities of bees and flowers throughout different parts of Minnesota, and was marking bees. So as part of this, she marked 298 bees at the Heuchera flowers, at the prairie alum root. She also marked 330 nests. So she uses these little tags to keep track of the nests, and you can see they can be pretty dense. All of these little tags here are all these nests. She sometimes uses these cages to put over the nest to keep track of the bees that are coming out. And then here's the really big one. You guys are already giving wows over that. She counted 25,460 stems of Heuchera. On this bee here, you can see this beautiful bright orange pollen that this flower makes. Once Marissa had found these nests, she would study them, see how long they were provisioning, how long they were being used, and noticed that some of them were not surviving, were getting dug up. And so she got a trail cam and found this little ground squirrel that was going and digging up the nests and eating these little wrapped up treats in there with the pollen and the little baby bees. Which was one of these natural history things that hadn't been documented before. So you can, when you're doing these kind of detailed studies, you can learn all kinds of cool things. So this is research that has been submitted for publication, but hasn't been peer-reviewed and published yet. But this gives you some idea of the population estimates that she saw across these different sites, and generally pretty low population. So between 5, 10, 20, 30, 50, maybe 75 bees. But there was one site that needs its whole own scale because there were over 400 bees in this population. And this was a site that had lots and lots of Heuchera. So for this specialist bee that really depends on this plant, we really can see that the more of the Heuchera plants that are there, the bigger those populations of Calides andrewsi will be. Currently, Marissa has a bunch of these Calides in the refrigerator in a fake winter. So she's seeing if she can rear them over the winter and do some more work with some of these bees next spring as well. Going back to management, we know that prairies are really important for bees, and our prairie systems are dependent on fire. There has been concern about what's going on with the bees when there's fire. There was a PhD student, Julia Broca, in the Native Bee Lab, who looked at this to see what was going on with the nesting, and saw that burned prairies actually had higher had a higher abundance of higher number of active nests. So showing that those, as we know, prairies depend on fire, but the bees in those systems depend on those prairies being burned as well. Continuing with nesting, Sammy Dolan did her master's degree in the Native Bee Lab, looking at bumblebee nests and looking at where these nests are made. A lot of the previous work in North America that's been done with bumblebee nests was done out east where there were more forests. And so all of this research was talking about how important forests were. Sammy was the first one to use these methods to find bumblebee nests more in prairie areas, and she was comparing forest, edge, and prairie, and found more bumblebees nesting in prairies and edge than in forest in the Midwest. So this is really important when we're trying to figure out how to manage habitat for bumblebees. Which brings me to one of our volunteer opportunities. One of the projects we've had the last couple of years is the Minnesota Bumblebee Nest Quest. So in 24 and 2025, we were doing this just in the Twin Cities, and we were training volunteers to go out and help us look for bumblebee nests. And we did find 18 nests. In 2024, we found 6 nests of 2 different species. This last year, we found 12 nests of 5 different species. The asterisks here are for Bombus fervidus, which is a more rare bumblebee that we were very excited to find the nest of. We are super pumped to be able to expand this program statewide this year. So we have a save the date here for our Nest Quest volunteer training, which is going to be online May 11th. And there's a QR code that can take you to the Nest Quest website where you can sign up. Of course, we'll also be sharing that link in the email that you'll get. It's a really fun protocol where you get to kind of wander around natural areas and look for bumblebee nests. So for this section, looking, we'll pause again for some questions. Looking at summarizing some of this for those agricultural areas, really getting plants on the land is the most important. If you're worrying about what kind of seed you're using, how big it is, the most important thing is just get those plants out there. You can help increase bee diversity by increasing plant diversity. So adding those rare plants to gardens and protecting natural areas that house those rare plants can really help increase our bee diversity. For nests, we don't have a lot of recommendations for creating nests. We more want people to preserve those wild spaces, have more wild spaces where those bees can find nesting habitat.
Awesome. We have lots more questions on native bees and also the ground nesting bees. And I'm appreciative that you gave us the mugshot of the ground squirrel. I think that was a great piece. So thank you, Elaine. So we have some questions about kind of the movement of native bee habitat. Do you find that it is new bees that are being discovered, or do you think that their habitat has changed over time, so then they are migrating?
For most of these, it is just discovering them because they're very rare. They're on rare plants. Some of them are in environments that are difficult to get to. So our colleagues at the DNR have been going to all corners of the state and going out in kayaks, getting to where they need to get to really try to find all of those bees. There are some bees that are moving in, so I didn't mention it, but currently we have just a handful of sightings in the state for the large carpenter bees. Xylocopa is the genus. They're really common in Iowa, anywhere, if people spend time anywhere kind of south of us. They are big, charismatic bees. We're just starting to see them over the last few years in the Twin Cities. There's a handful of records in southern Minnesota. That's one of those bees that, as the climate is warming, I think we'll start seeing more of them.
Sure. So both and. It depends.
Yes.
Yep. Some questions on some ground nesting bees. So kind of the depth of the eggs that are laid, and then just for gardening purposes to make sure that they're not destroying it, as well as the conditions of the sun exposure versus shade, kind of everything with that.
Yeah, it's kind of all over the map. So they don't make it easy. Some of them are pretty shallow. Some of them can just be a few inches. Some of them can be, feet that they dig down. Tilling is definitely something that can destroy these nests if they are there. But then some of them like soil that has been tilled because they like the looser soil. So really the best way to help them is kind of having a mix of different stuff, keeping an eye out for them. If you do see holes in your in a garden bed that you want to till up and you think that there might be bees that are nesting in there, a simple trick you can do is to just get a little plastic cup or a glass cup even, and put it down over it in the evening, and then the next morning if you see a bee trying to get out, then you know that hole has a nest there, has a mother that's trying to get food for her babies.
Oh, cool. Some not so cool things, jumping worms. Does jumping worm activity impact the ground nesting bees?
No idea.
Yet to be determined.
Yes.
Yet to be studied.
Yeah.
And maybe some better or recommendations for mulching. Do you have anything of how to make sure?
Yeah. So for mulching, I mean, the big thing is like don't use or try to avoid using landscape fabric because or barriers that really make a distinct barrier that the bees can't get through. Some bees will kind of prefer areas with a little bit of mulch. Some like completely bare soil. So really kind of having a variety of different things, having some places where you might need to mulch to keep weeds down, and just don't go too thick with it. And some bees like that, having some areas where there is just bare ground, some areas where there's loose soil, kind of a mix of different things.
Sure. So that's for ground nesting. And we also have some questions on the stem cavity nest. So one person had heard that it takes 2 years before it will get used after leaving it. Is that true?
That is not true, but there is a 2-year-ish cycle of its use. So once they've laid eggs in there, those eggs will survive over the winter and come out the next year. So the cycle is usually around 1.5 years is enough for the stem to, have had a nest and have it develop and come out. But 2 years is kind of safer since these bees are coming out at different times of year. So some of them come out in April, some of them don't come out till August. There's a lot of overlap for when the bees are using stems. There is a handout that I'm sharing in the resources that goes over best management for those stems for gardens.
Oh, thank you for demystifying that and that clarification.
Yeah.
Maybe just one more on like the artificial cavity nesting. Can you talk about the value of bee houses? Are they useful when well maintained?
Yeah, well maintained is key there. So there are some designs that don't allow you to really take them out and clean them out, or they're too short. If they're less than 6 inches deep, it's not the best for the bees. It increases, there's parasites that come in at the ends. So there's kind of a bigger proportion of them that'll get hit by parasites if the nests are too short. I generally prefer just making native habitat. So having stems that you leave in your garden. The main value I see for those bees houses is kind of educational. So if you're able to put them up and observe what's happening and learn and get excited about who's there, I think that's the main benefit for those bee houses.
Very neat. I think we can let you go to the next section that some of these questions might be answered. So,
okay, yeah,
thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, for these native bees, we need all these 4 actions. We need flowers. We've been talking about the homes, climate action, as well as help with collecting data. So I do want to talk about rusty patch bumblebee because it is our state bee here in Minnesota. So this was a bee that was common pre-2000. And then currently these blue dots here are showing the only places where we're finding them as of records that we have for June of this last year. So there's lots of places where they used to be where they are not. But we do still have these clusters where they are being found. And so this coincided, this loss of them coincided with this failure of commercial rearing of the western bumblebee, which was closely related to the rusty patch bumblebee. And so at the same time that rusty patch kind of disappeared, there were 2 other species, all closely related. They're in the same subgenus of bumblebees. So this spillover of diseases from commercially produced bumblebees is what we think is the most likely scenario based on kind of the timing. We know bees that were being raised commercially were transported back and forth from Europe. We do see some refuges at higher elevations where there were some dots in Appalachia that where they seem to be doing kind of well. But it's really hard to know for sure, as the strains of these diseases are difficult to pinpoint. There's other things like climate change and pesticides. There was a big increase in neonicotinoid use at the same time that these bees were declining. But most scientists think it was this problem with the disease spillover. And as we're looking at what's going on with rusty patch bumblebee, trying to help them recover, monitoring has been really important. And here's more, recent locations from rusty patch bumblebee sightings. You can see there's these clusters around the Twin Cities, around Madison, Milwaukee, Chicago, a lot of these urban areas. So there is a doctoral candidate in the Caravo Native Bee Lab, Mary Powley, who has been looking at, are we actually more likely to find bumblebees, rusty patch bumblebees, are they more likely to be there in urban or rural environments? Is this, looking at the map, you might think, oh, it looks like rusty patch bumblebees like urban areas. But she found no difference in the probability of rusty patch bumblebees being at a site if it was urban or rural. We've also, in our work with rusty patch bumblebees, have been really lucky to have some nests to observe. So, here is a nest that was in the foundation of someone's house, and we were able to go there and collect all kinds of data so we can learn more about rusty patch bumblebees and how to help them. We've been able to get a lot of information about genetic diversity. So at nests, you'll usually find some dead bees. We're also able to take these little tiny clips from the bottom part of their middle leg and extract DNA from that. We're trying out some ways to not cut pieces off of them and just use these swabs that get some hairs, and we can do some DNA extraction. And then we've also been able to collect some whole bees, which are needed for doing this kind of whole genome look at rusty patch bumblebees. So this was me dropping rusty patch bumblebees into liquid nitrogen to send them to the researcher to use for this genome, doing this whole genome, which was not my favorite thing to do with rusty patch bumblebees, but we were able to just like instantly preserve that DNA. They were able to get a really good look at what's going on with the DNA, and then that is really informative for other studies in the future as we're figuring out what is the genetic diversity, how are they how are their populations doing. And some of this genetic information has been put together already to look at rusty patch bumblebees in the Midwest through a few different areas and looking at populations that that pop up there. And so we do see this is another graph where these kind of different dots represent these different populations. And if the dots are kind of out on their own, then they're unique. And if you see here, there is a lot of the Midwest is kind of all in a clump, but Appalachia is out on its own, and so is the Twin Cities. So Minnesota is different for rusty patch bumblebees. And unfortunately, we're also seeing a lot of inbreeding. So one of the things we worry about when there's a big population drop is there's going to be an increase in inbreeding. And there won't be enough genetic diversity. So we do see more inbreeding happening in the Twin Cities and that kind of central Midwest populations than in the Appalachian populations. We also see fewer numbers of colonies on the landscape. And this is from looking at the relationship between the different bees that are taken. If they're sisters or brothers or not, you can make estimates of how many colonies are out there. So this is all done from that genetic work. And we see that rusty patch bumblebee, which is Bombus affinis there, along with Bombus pennsylvanicus, the American bumblebee, those are two bees that we're concerned about declining. They both have kind of fewer colonies on the landscape than some of our common bumblebees. So that brings worry for like random events possibly causing local extinction with rusty patch bumblebee. So unfortunately, their population health at this point is not looking great in most places. We were also able with the nests to look at pollen that they were collecting. So we would take one of their pollen loads off of their legs and then let them bring the other one home. And we were able to analyze that to see what plants they were collecting. And so the biggest plants they were using here are at the bottom. And if you know your plants, you can see that a lot of the pollen is coming from invasive species. So those three at the bottom are nightshade, alfalfa, and burdock, and that was making up most of the pollen that the rusty patch bumblebees were bringing in. And does that mean that that's the best pollen for them? Not necessarily. It probably means that's what they could find. But if you are removing invasives that we know that bees like, just being mindful to get some native flowers that bees like in there as well. We've also been getting information about diseases, and again, not great news, where again, Bombus affinis is a rusty patch bumblebee. We see a much higher levels of particularly this disease, which this is the microsporidium is the same disease we were worried about coming to the rusty patch bumblebee from the commercially managed bees. So almost all of the rusty patch bumblebees that have been examined are infected with this disease. So we've looked at this across a few different nests and are still getting a lot more information, but still definitely seeing a high prevalence of this disease. So we also spend time dissecting the nests if we can at the end of the colony cycle to just learn about what's in there, how big are they. So we've been able to examine a few different nests over the last few years. And before we published our paper with this, there were only 4 previous publications that were talking about rusty patch bumblebee nests, and we were also able to document one of the largest nests. So even though the bees did have some disease, they still were able to make a really big nest. So that's good. For looking at what's going on with rusty patch bumblebees, for action here, we really like people to take and share photos, keep eyes out for nests, and share that information so we can keep learning more about them. Before we go to questions, there's just like a couple more little things I want to just say, just to have people be aware of, and then we can get to questions. So again, plug in for NestQuest with getting keeping your eyes out for nests. I want to mention our Pollinator Ambassadors program, which we do have a save the date for this program where you can train to become a pollinator expert. So we do all this training online. Anyone throughout Minnesota is welcome. At the end of your training, you can receive a pollinator education toolkit that we've developed that has all these great resources for talking to people about pollinators. We also have an online version of this kit. So if you don't want to do the program or don't have time for it, you want just some online pieces, we have that as well. I also want to mention the Minnesota Bumblebee Atlas, where people adopt grids across Minnesota, go out and survey for bumblebees. And this is a really fun way to get out and see the bumblebees in your area. I think this is my last thing I'm plugging is my Bumblebee ID class. This is also online if you want to learn about how to identify all the different kinds of bumblebees that you have. We have an online course that you can do at your own pace for learning about bumblebees. And recognizing all these people that help support all this work we do. And I'm happy to take questions.
Perfect. I just put all those links in the chat. So, but don't worry if you guys don't get to all of them. I'm sure everyone's browsers are going crazy. So we could focus on Elaine's presentation and questions, but you can always refer back to those in the resource email. So thank you, Elaine. That was really informative. I really appreciated how the breadth of information that you shared with us today, because the Bee Lab and you are doing a ton of work. So I'm so glad we were able to highlight that. So thank you so much for doing that. Lots of round of applause from everyone in the chat. A couple of questions. I'll focus mainly on the rusty patch bumblebee, and then we'll kind of circle back to other ones that maybe weren't answered before. But so many people were asking. Oh, big heart. Many people were asking about the bringing genetic diversity in for bumblebees if it goes below a certain threshold. Is that possible that human intervention can do that?
Yeah, there is discussion about doing captive rearing of rusty patch bumblebee, in different areas where there's different genetic sources. So the first step is kind of seeing what's going on with them genetically, and either using that to bolster populations or reintroduce them into areas where they were. So we're still at the point of figuring out, what's going to be best to do in terms, for their genetic diversity. It is a species that's really easy to rear. Back when they were common, I used to rear them. so it is hopeful that that we can do that and help bolster their genetic diversity that way, and get them back in some of the places where they used to be.
Oh, nice. Very strategic human intervention, it sounds like. Perfect. Yes. Do bumblebees ever show aggression? Are there times that are better to observe and interact with them?
The different species vary in how aggressive they are. So most bumblebees, we're telling volunteers to go find nests, and nests are usually where they would be most aggressive. But usually, if if you stay a couple feet back, you can observe them going in and out of their nests without any problem. Sometimes when nests are really big, they'll usually be like one bee that comes out and kind of buzzes around you and lets you know you need to back off a little more. When they're foraging, we really don't worry about that at all. It's just kind of at the nests.
Caitlin in the chat says the golden retrievers of the bee world. So, good. Does the disease prevalence in rusty patch bumblebee automatically mean negative health outcomes, or could they be asymptomatic?
That's a good question, and we do know, people have done experiments where they have bumblebees, not rusty patch bumblebees, but other species of bumblebees, and they will feed them, increase the amount of the especially this veriforma disease or some of the other diseases, and then they document what happens with the bees. So we do know that they do that. These ones we're talking about do have negative impacts on the individual, and then that impacts the colony's ability to grow and reproduce.
And kind of going back, there was a previous question about bee lawns and native plantings, are they in some ways inadvertently hurting and encouraging the transmission of disease?
There is a lot that we don't know yet about that kind of where diseases, how they're interacting on the flowers, how much that's really happening, how bad, if it's really, back to the last question, is it really having a health impact on the bees? There is the possibility when there's flowers that both honeybees and other bees like, and the honeybees are having disease problems. They may share some of those diseases, but um, yeah, still lots of questions about whether that's going to have health impacts. I'm not worried about it so much in a lot of those kind of bee lawn kind of situations and garden situations. Mostly, I just want to see more flowers getting out there on the landscape. I do think just being mindful of when you do have rare bees, we do have rusty patch bumblebees all around a lot of our urban areas. Just making sure that you have a variety of flowers. So if you have a bee lawn, it helps to also have like a pollinator garden with some other flowers that maybe bumblebees might like more than what's in the lawn.
So bigger picture thinking, there's benefits as well as cons, but hopefully they outweigh the cons. Perfect. How do we look for the rusty patched bumblebee nest? The best places to look.
That is a good question. We don't have a lot of records of where they've been found. The records we have, they've usually been in a rodent nest. So sometimes that rodent nest is in the foundation of someone's house. Sometimes it's out in in a wooded area. Sometimes it can be in a prairie. We really need. We're hoping with our Nest Quest program, we're hoping we can find some rusty patch bumblebee nests and hopefully narrow things in a little bit more so we can figure out how to recommend what they really like for nesting habitat. We know they can use a lot of different things, but are there any things that they're really associated with?
Sure. Is the data from iNaturalist project Queen Quest being used at all? Do you know?
I am not sure. So that is a really cool project that's looking at more at overwintering queens. So bumblebees in the so the new queens survive the winter by digging themselves down underground, and then people are trying to. We have even less documentation of that than we do of nesting, but we do encourage people to keep gathering those data as well.
Perfect. I know we're getting a lot of comments about volunteer opportunities. So this is a great prelude to all these volunteer opportunities that people can participate in. A couple of other questions. I know we're running down on time, but kind of the intersection of native bees and honeybees. There were some questions about research being done with feral honeybees. Are you familiar with that at all?
Yes. In so the feral honeybees, ones that live out on their own and that aren't managed, they tend to be more common in warmer climates. So there are feral colonies that survive here in Minnesota, but since the varroa mites came in, that tends to make it hard for colonies to survive without being treated over the winter. So we don't have a ton of the feral honeybee colonies here in Minnesota. But I know there are researchers looking into kind of density of those feral colonies, especially in the Southwest. The southwestern areas of North America, that's our highest bee density, our bee diversity. So there's a lot of really cool rare bees that are down there. And so I know people are people are concerned about preserving that bee diversity and the potential impact of those feral colonies.
That's some good context to know for everyone. How big of a problem is this? Uh, let's see. I know you. This is kind of a broader question. This might be outside of the scope of your research, but has there been any conversations about how the agriculture community has been using this information brought by the Bee Lab?
That is something that we are currently developing some plans to do some more. I know with the project that we did in Southwest Minnesota, where we had all those plantings down there. Those were all new plantings that we worked directly with growers, and we had an amazing response from growers down there that were really interested in pollinator habitat. We're really excited to put that pollinator habitat in. And so we've during that project, we were doing a lot more communicating down, especially in that corner of the state, and working with those growers. We've been kind of, our research has been going in some different directions, but especially me as an extension educator, I really want to work on getting the information in the hands of the farmers to figure out how best to get the pollinator habitat established.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome, especially because it tends to be outside of this group. So it's instead of being an echo chamber, how do we get it out, to people that maybe aren't as aware? So I appreciate that.
And there's some really cool work going on in other places. Iowa State has this prairie strip project that they've been doing for quite a while, where they have these prairie strips that they put through agricultural areas, and then all these benefits not just for pollinators, but for water filtration and all kinds of things. So that's a really good resource too.
Mm-hmm. And that's kind of in the ag space. There's another question about in the more urban space, can bumblebees and other bees get over the big freeways?
That is something that I've wondered about too. We've done a lot of bumblebee surveys along roadsides for one reason or another, and we do definitely find dead bumblebees along the road. So we know that bees can bees will get killed by car strikes. We don't really know how big of an impact that is. So we know that it happens. We've talked a little bit about is there any way to help them get over? So they have a lot of these things for different kinds of wildlife to get across freeways or get over freeways. And if we put up a big, even I wonder if like those sound walls, if they fly up, will they stay up till they get across and go down on the other side? A lot of it depends on the volume of traffic, how much of an impact it has, and good research questions, but not anything that we've studied yet.
There's only so much time and so much money to do this research, but the work that you've already done and are in the process of doing is an incredible step forward for pollinator conservation research. So I really appreciate this. You do not have an easy job doing the research and the extension part of things and putting that information out. So thank you again for taking the time to share all this with us today. And we just really appreciate it, as everyone else does in the chat. So thank you for teaching us how to support pollinators more effectively. So, and
thank you so much for all these brilliant questions.
They are, and there's so many of them, and we haven't been able to answer them all, especially there's kind of some more specific ones. So if we didn't get to your question today, we'll be sending a ton of resources as well as how to contact your local extension office to answer all these really individualized questions and everything. So all contact information, all the goodies will be out on the email on Friday. So thank you everyone that joined us today and asked all these great questions, and thank you, Elaine. So this concludes our second session of our 5th annual Pollinator Webinar Series, and we hope you'll join us tomorrow. And our final presentation will be Extension Master Gardeners it's Pollinator Habitats in Action, Tips, Tricks, and Inspiration from Master Gardeners. So we hope to see you tomorrow, and take care, everyone. Stay warm.